talk mostly about this book, but I have two book projects that I'm involved in right now that I'm really excited about. My passion is Canadian literature. I love Canadian writers and I love Canadian books, and I do whatever I can to promote them. And whenever someone's got some sort of CanLit promotion thing going on, they always ask me to be involved. And I don't know how to say no, so I always am involved. But I have two really exciting ones right now. One is called Barrett for Books. These two young women in Toronto, Amanda Leduc and Allegra Young, one day they were talking on Twitter and they had this idea. They said, CanLit is so sexy. Everyone talks about as if reading's boring, but CanLit is really sexy and reading's always been sexy. And they had this because they went with this sort of idea and they decided they were going to do a naked calendar of Canadian authors. So they asked me, and not being able to say no, I said yes. So I said, I like to say, my parents thought I was finally old enough to not embarrass them anymore. And here I am suddenly naked on the internet at 44. But the other people in it are Jan Martel and Terry Fallis and Amy McKay and a whole slew of really well-known authors, Vincent Lam. And it's going to raise money for PEN Canada, so to deal with censorship issues. So what they're getting at now is, what does bearing it for books mean, and how do Canadian authors bear it for books, or how do authors in countries where they risk death for portraying their ideas, how are they bearing it for books? So they asked me to write a little blog about what bearing it for books meant to me, and I'm just going to read that for you before I start on my actual book talk. And I'm talking about the first book over there with the white cover, my very first book. It's a short story collection. It's called Anything Boys Can Do. In 2006, I published my first book, a collection of stories about miscommunication, dysfunctional relationships, and infidelity. I had recently gone through a divorce, and I like to announce that the book, called Anything Boys Can Do, was about the death of the institution of marriage. I said this with great conviction. I was remarried by the time it came out. But the death of the institution of marriage and the absurdity of lifelong monogamy. These earnest declarations morphed into satire by the time I finally took to the road for the book tour, gigantically pregnant and very happy and monogamously remarried. Reviewers, few as they were, called the book raw and edgy. The Victoria Times columnist praised it for its original and honest take on female sexuality. The reviewer wrote, "For centuries, terms to define female sexuality have been along the lines of slut, tart, and horror. There are, sadly, no words that describe female desire that are not pejorative. And this lack of available vocabulary is one reason why Angie Abdou's debut short story collection, Anything Boys Can Do, is important. Most of Abdou's stories focus on female protagonists who wholeheartedly pursue sexual relationships." That's all great, obviously, except for a minor detail. I have parents. They know how to read. This is where things get tricky. People tell aspiring writers to kick potential audiences out of their heads during the writing process. Don't worry about what people will think, they say. Don't censor yourself, they say. Wonderful advice, sure, but the reality of being a published writer sure comes crashing down hard when you see your new husband's grandmother lined up at your book signing table clutching her freshly purchased copy. The truth is that people will read what you write. Moreover, people will judge you based on what you write. And I don't mean judge your writing. I mean they will judge you. One of my mother's best friends read Anything Boys Can Do and responded, "Being a writer must be hard. It must be kind of like walking into the middle of Main Street, pulling down your pants, and yelling, 'Hey everybody, what do you think?'" Yep, it's kind of like that. And it gets a little more like that with each new book. It also gets more challenging during the writing process to forget about that uncomfortable element of exposure that comes with publication. Above my writing desk, I've taped Hemingway's advice to write hard and clear about what hurts. I recognize that quality in the writing that holds me fast to the page. The fiction I most admire deals with emotions, ideas, and subjects that really matter to the writer at a deep and personal level. Such a personal investment creates rawness and energy that a writer can't create from a safe distance. But it also leaves a writer vulnerable and exposed. When it came time to take my Barrett for book picture, I was nervous. I wondered if I could go through with it. I thought it would be difficult, even humiliating. It wasn't. I bear it for books every day at my writing desk as I strive to write hard and clear about what hurts. That is difficult. Taking off my clothes, jumping up on that desk and letting someone snap a photograph, it's the easiest thing I've ever done in that office. That's an exaggeration. It was a little bit hard. So that's the Bear It for Book project. But if you want to find out more, you can look bearitforbooks.ca on the internet. And I'll tell you about Project Bookmark, another interesting initiative at the end. But first I'm going to talk about this book, The Canterbury Trail. This has 2 stickers on it. This is a funny story. This is a gold medal IPI award. IPI is for Independent Publishing Award. They got the gold medal for Canada West, and that one is legit. I really won that award for this book. This is a BC Book Prize award, and what I did is I took it off my friend's book, J.J. Lee's, and stuck it on this book. And so writers always complain during award season. They say so much rides on these awards, and it's so subjective, and only a very small handful of writers get recognized, and the rest of the books get forgotten about. And so it's really easy to get bitter, but I decided you just need to be proactive. So I just go and I got this sucker, and I stuck it right on there. I said, next I'm going to go for the Pulitzer and the Giller. I'll just cover the cover with stickers. This is my 3rd book, but it was, in a lot of ways, it was my first idea for a book. I wanted to be a writer. I never started writing until I was 30 years old, writing fiction. I wanted to be a writer. I can remember very clearly, ever since the first time I fell in love with a book, and that was One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish by Dr. Seuss, and I was 4. And at that time I thought, I want to be able to do this for people. I want to create that kind of pleasure. I want to be able to invent these wild worlds and these wacky characters. And so I wanted to be a writer, and as a kid I made up stories, like all kids do. So then how did I get from there to being 30 and not having written fiction yet? I think when I got to the teenage years, that kind of self-consciousness sets in, where it's really important what people think of you, and you don't have very much self-confidence, or at least I didn't. And I wasn't really in the peer group that wrote. You know, I wasn't one of the smart kids, I wasn't one of the artsy kids. I wasn't the kind of kid who decided to take a creative writing class. And it's such a shame, because we had this wonderful teacher called Mr. Curry, who was so great. And now I run into him at writers' festivals, and I always say it's so embarrassing when people ask me, they say, oh, you went to Central, you must have taken Mr. Curry's writing class, and I have to say, no, I never did. And he said, you think that's embarrassing? Try when people say, oh, you taught at Central, Angie Abdou must have taken your classes. So we just made a deal that I'll say, I went to Central where Mr. Curry taught, and he'll say, I taught at Central where Angie Abdou went, and he just won't mention anything else. But I never did take those classes. And so then I got to university, and then I didn't have a portfolio because I'd never taken it in high school, and then I didn't have the confidence to go ahead and apply at university. So what I did is, I think it's pretty common, I lived this parallel existence to what I really wanted. I think, so I did an English degree. I did 4 English degrees, in fact. I have a PhD in English, 2 of them. And so I spent my life reading books and writing about books and teaching books instead of writing fiction itself, right? So I lived along admiring other writers and admiring that life, but not doing exactly what I wanted to do. And I think that's probably common, because if you have a dream, it's easier to hold it off and say, I bet you I could do that if I tried. I bet you if I ever had time. And if I ever have time, I'll write a book. Or when I retire, I'll write a book. If I had a chance, I'd be a really good writer. I think I could do that. Rather than trying it and finding out it's hard, and maybe you suck, and maybe it's going to be a long haul, and maybe you're going to get rejected, and maybe people are going to make fun of you. It's easier to hold it off as this nice, clean thing that one day you'll do. But a month before my 30th birthday, I was driving from Calgary to Fernie, and I was in a head-on collision. So I was driving on the highway speed, and I see lights coming right at me, and I woke up in the Foothills Hospital, not knowing if I would ever walk again. So then I thought I was dead, right? You see lights coming at you, and you think, that's it, game over. So when I woke up, the first thing I did was started writing fiction. I started getting all these books about how to write fiction, and reading, and doing the exercises, and going to workshops at UBC and in Saskatchewan and all over the country, and working with whatever writers I could. And then I started on that short story collection. Not because short stories are easier to write, in a lot of ways they're harder, because you have to reinvent the whole world every 20 pages. You have to reinvent the setting, the characters, what's the theme, what's the kind of language I'm going to use. Every 10, 15, 20 pages you have to start all over. Whereas a novel, you get a certain amount of momentum once you get your story and your setting and your theme and your characters, so you can ride that momentum a bit. But I wanted the short stories to develop my craft, to learn how to write dialogue, to learn how to make up characters, to learn how to write convincing setting, and to be able to send things out every once in a while and get that feedback. And because I'm really goal-oriented, which is such a nice word for what I am, my husband might use a different word, obsessive, driven, intense. My students always write that on their evaluations. She's a little intense, like I might not know that. but so I'm a little intense, I'm goal-oriented, so I had this idea that I would write 10 to 12 stories to eventually try to get a book out of them, which worked. And then I did The Bone Cage, a novel I've been really lucky with. It's got a lot of attention about Olympic athletes, and it was on Canada Reads in 2012, I'm guessing. I don't even remember my own chronology. I'm represented by Georges Laraque, this wonderful NHL player who's a celebrity defender and defended on these debates with Jean Gomeshi. So that was a real thrill to be around that kind of celebrity people and have the whole country paying attention to my book. And then eventually I worked my way up to tackle this idea that I'd always talked about. And the idea I talked about that turned into this book was when I was living my shadow life, I was a medievalist. I taught medieval literature, and one of the texts I taught is the most famous medieval poem, Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Whenever I say that, I hear my publisher in my head, because she always says to me, don't talk about Chaucer, people don't want to hear about Chaucer. She said, talk about the sex, talk about the drugs, talk about the relationship with the environment, talk about anything except for Chaucer. But I think you can take it, so I'm going to talk about Chaucer for just a minute. So Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, of course, is a group of characters on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket. It's April, and they're people who wouldn't normally spend time together, but he uses the device of the pilgrimage to get a cross-section of the whole society together, and then they tell stories along the way. So it's an interlinked short story collection. And when I used to talk about being a writer rather than actually writing, my mother had gone on an eco-tour trip with Robert Bateman. So they were in Costa Rica. Robert Bateman, the famous nature painter, was the guide, and they made their way through Costa Rica looking at sloths and birds and him drawing or painting, sketching. And that struck me as you turn that into a kind of Canterbury Tales. These people who don't know each other from normal life. I thought of it as a pilgrimage in the sense of them traveling single file through these jungles. And I guess pilgrimage is something that is really a holiday as an escape from regular life, but something that you've granted higher significance to, whether it's spiritual significance or educational significance or, personal growth. So I thought that was a kind of pilgrimage. And then I imagined, because these people didn't know each other at all, that they would be telling each other stories about their life as they traveled along. But since they would never see each other again, they could make up and say whatever they wanted. It could be pure fiction, and then I could have this story about them getting caught out in their lives and all kinds of things like that, and have an environmental sort of theme to it. And I even had a name made up for this imaginary novel that I only ever talked about, and it was called Cloud Catchers, which when I'm making fun of myself, I'll say, oh, I don't even know what I meant by that, cloud catchers, but I actually do know what I meant. My mom had told me about the mango groves, that they put these big nets over top of the mango groves, and the idea was that the nets would catch the clouds. I don't think this works, but that they would catch the clouds and gather them over the mango grove so that it would rain and they would get the precipitation that they needed to produce fruit. And I thought that was a neat metaphor for the creative process, that you're trying to catch something that's uncatchable and trying to make something fertile grow from it. So kind of like writing a novel. So that was my idea, that I never ever did. But after I wrote those first two books, I thought I want to think more about this, what would a contemporary Canterbury Tales be like? By that time I knew enough about writing that I knew you had to actually know something about what you're writing about, and I don't know anything about ecotourism or Costa Rica. But I started to think, what would a Canterbury Tales inspired by my own place where I live be like? And I live in Fernie, BC, a town of 4,000 people right in the Rocky Mountains. Kind of a mix of resource, a really thriving coal industry, a very thriving tourism industry, a great ski hill. There's a real mix, so the types thing in Chaucer works really well. Someone once said, why didn't you write this book about Moose Jaw, where you're originally from? And it would never work with Moose Jaw because we don't have the types. Like Chaucer had representatives of the working class, the praying class, the fighting class, women, men, upper, lower, all these people who would never normally be together in medieval life, and he puts them together for the pilgrimage. And Fernie has that same dynamic of types. We have the hippies who've come there to escape the rat race and live closer to nature, the ski bums who come there for the big mountain skiing, the rednecks who were maybe raised there or come there for the coal mines, and these are people, the divisions blur, of course, but there are people who self-identify with these labels, or who you would identify as redneck, hippie, ski bum, the developers who are there to pave paradise and put in a parking lot. And so I have each of these types. And in Chaucer, it's the sweet showers in April start, and that people long to go on a pilgrimage all of a sudden for renewal. In the Canterbury Trail, it is, as we like to say, it's barfing out or puking out. It's snowing really hard. So it's April, the ski lifts have closed for the season, and it starts barfing out. So all these different people decide to go into the backcountry cabin for the last snowy weekend of the season. So the rednecks are snowmobiling in, the snowshoers, the hippies are snowshoeing in, the skiers are ski trekking in, And you get this sinking feeling that they're all going to end up in the same cabin for the weekend. So this real cross-section of this little town. And I wanted to get this idea, feeling of it being so crowded. So it's this narrow valley. They're going up a narrow trail, and then they're going into this tiny little cabin with no electricity or plumbing or anything like that. And you have this just overcrowded with all the types of Fernie. Now I'm looking at my notes. talk. So, yeah, and in the same way, it's a pilgrimage. It's a holiday apart from real life, but it's also something that they've vested with this greater meaning, right? It's a physical challenge to get it. Basically, they're going up something like this and skiing back over the other side and staying in a cabin, skiing on the backside, and then trekking out on their way home. This is actually Fernie. This is except for the sky's not orange, but this is our three sisters, and this is Mount Hosmer, and this is a painting by Laura Nelson, a wonderful painter who used to own the bookstore. The originally started the bookstore in Fernie. I'm going to actually read you something. First, I'll tell you one more thing, is that